Hi, folks. This is the MD screen presentation. We're going to be starting in about 2 minutes. I'm just going to give a little bit of time for folks to trickle in. Um, so just hang tight, and we'll be starting momentarily. All right, I think this is long enough. Morning, everybody. I'm Eli Straussman. I'm a GIS analyst here at Siege. I am a recipient of a master's degree from the University of Maryland in GIS. My focus is mainly on spatial interpolation, statistical methodology, along with app development for the lab here. Just like to give a quick shout out to my other colleagues, Dr. Haile Tadasi and Bukula Agabula, great coworkers, and I'm sure you're going to see some of their presentations later today and tomorrow. Highly worth checking that out. So today we're going to be covering the Maryland EJ screen. The EJ screen, I'm sure you guys are somewhat familiar with, is a tool used to index and catalog the amount of pathogens in environmental pathogens, chronological pathogens in a community. Um, we are focusing on the state of Maryland for our EJ screen, obviously, because we are located in Maryland. That's where we do most of our work. But I think a good place to start off here actually is to kind of dive a little bit into the um, reasoning behind using geographical methodology to kind of track these environmental justice outcomes. And as you can see on the quote at the bottom of the page, one thing that's really um, clear is that zip codes are generally a better predictor of your health than your genetic code. And the reason for that is because where you live obviously impacts your ability to access, public services, or your proximity to environmental pathogens, or, your proximity to things like the shoreline. All of these can have drastic impacts on your physical well-being and your mental well-being. And these things translate directly into environmental justice considerations. So when we're thinking about how we organize an EJ screen, a tool that can take in a wide variety of data and synthesize it to a single score that is, both informative, useful, and comprehensive. And it's no small feat. As you can see in the breakdown on the right, there are a lot of different factors that go into someone's, general well-being. And that goes from as personal as your individual healthcare decisions to, the more ephemeral, such as, how close is the nearest park, right? Things like that are not necessarily easy to quantify, but are nonetheless very important to your health. So what is the MDEJ screen, or the Maryland Environmental Justice Screen? So this is a tool that is being developed by Siege, by myself here at Siege, and my colleagues. This is the third iteration of the Maryland EJ screen. We depreciated the second iteration 2 months ago because the data is no longer up to date. The point of this tool is to um, create a visualization for community members to use to determine, their relative EJ, environmental justice score as compared to their colleagues or to their peers in, the state of Maryland. Um, if this tool is based off of another tool called the California EJ screen, so we copied a lot of their methodology, but um, tweaked it to be more in line with the considerations of Maryland's environmental justice. So there are plenty of EJ screens, so why aren't we using those? Um, and the long and short of it um, is personality, right? The state of Maryland is different than New Jersey, is different than um, Pennsylvania, is different than every other state in the union, obviously. And each state has its own EJ considerations that, yes, might be shared between states, but aren't always. And so creating these custom tools for each locality actually allows people to have a more in-depth view on their environmental justice quotient. So um, while the EPA EJ screen and the CJS screens are both very fantastic tools, and I highly recommend you check them out, um, the scale of those tools automatically makes them less useful at a closer scale, right? So it's harder for residents of, say, Baltimore to get accurate assessments of their environmental justice quotient using these national scale tools. And I believe there was a speaker yesterday who even mentioned that they are making EJ screens for individual cities and individual communities, because the closer you get down to the ground level, the more context you have to determine what are the environmental justice considerations for those areas. So because of that, we are focusing our research on just the state of Maryland. So, how is the score made? So the score takes in a wide range of data sets. Obviously, I'm not going to list them all out here. I think that would be a waste of everyone's time. I encourage you to check the tool and look at them yourself. But essentially, how the tool works is it um, we provide it with a wide variety of data. Usually it's taken from the census or from the Maryland Data Service. The state of Maryland has a data repository, like most states, that contains a lot of information in terms of infrastructure and environmental considerations. So we take this wide range of data and we condense it into 5 buckets. And those buckets are socioeconomic, environmental, um, the effects of environmental effects, and climate change and health. Now, each of these bins have multiple sets of have multiple sets of data points that contribute to the overall score. Now, it's not so simple that we can just kind of combine all this data and then spit out a score. There's um, all of this data comes in different forms, right? So we have to kind of devise a way to be able to take this wide set of data that looks at things on the individual level or looks at individual places as in single points on the map and find a way to translate it into a number that has some merit. And so the California EJ screen, which this is based off of, uses a formula that takes in this data and then weights it by the difference between the demographic index of that locality to the nation. Now, what is a demographic index? So a demographic index is, as you can see in this middle box, is um, a very straightforward way to determine the relative disadvantage of a community, and it's very straightforward. It is literally take the percentage of the population that is below the poverty line and the percentage of individuals who are BIPOC, and you divide it by two. You just get the average, and when you do that, you get a number that allows you to have a very general sense of what areas are, more impoverished and, generally more disadvantaged than others. So we run each one of these data points through this score, and that gives us an index score, but we're not there yet. See, with each score, the from the data points, they are all kind of weighed equally. So we haven't made a lot of tweaks to how this model um, divides the import of the various buckets. And the reason for this is because it's not very straightforward. Um, while there are, while there are different levels of impact that, say, sociological factors can have or environmental factors can have, as a whole, they all contribute relatively equally to the, total environmental justice impact. In fact, when we talk about environmental justice, we're not talking about necessarily the specific impact on, one individual person, although that does factor into the analysis. We're talking more about the general impact around an entire community and how these different factors can impact that community. So once we have our whole sets of scores, we kind of have to combine them. And so the way we do this is again based off of the California EJ screen. Now, the California EJ screen, like ours, takes a large quantity of data and tries to combine it into a single number. You'll find that's, a very common theme here. Um, and while they only have four buckets or bins, if you will, to segregate their data by, we have included a fifth, which is the climate change index. The climate change index includes things like floodwater effect, urban heat islands, um, things like that, precipitation, landslides, you know, all of those things that are, becoming increasingly more dangerous and prevalent in our society. So um, in order to adjust the model to account for this, we essentially um, compartmentalize the two sectors of an environmental justice score, which is the personal and the spatial or community. So the personal obviously is your health and your socioeconomic index, right? How do that affects individuals in an area, and then the general would be everything else, things that may not have a direct impact on you, but nonetheless have a huge impact on your environmental justice quotient. So when we take the average of these two numbers and we multiply them, we get an environmental justice score. Now, the funny thing about this score is that the number itself is pretty much useless. It is, the range of score can go from negative, 100,000 to positive 1,000,000. The importance of the number isn't the number itself, but its relative distance from the next tract. So what we do is we take this large range of numbers and we reclass them. We put them in a percentile form so we can kind of determine how these numbers stack up in comparison to the same variables in other localities in the state of Maryland. Um, sorry, one moment. Still getting over a cold. So, what do these numbers mean? Um, the numbers that you see when you actually, enter the environmental justice screen is um, the percentile of the um, of the variable. So you'll see here we have um, we have a health percentile of 68, demographic of 74, an exposure of 100, effects of 95, and climate of 91. When we average those out, we get a total EJ of 91. What this means, in effect, is that 68% of the tracks that are not this tract have lower, as in they have better health quotients than this tract. 74% of the tracks have a better demographic index than the rest of them. Exposure, this is one of, if not the worst tract that is being exposed by environmental effects or environmental exposure. And 95th on environmental effects and so on and so forth. Um, the important thing to know is we're trying to make it intuitive. So the important thing to know is that the higher the number, the worse the environmental justice quotient is. Um, and later in the presentation, I'm going to go into a lot more depth about how those numbers were derived. But the long and short of it is, if you live in a neighborhood that has an EJ score above 50, that's something to take note of. All right, this doesn't work when you're using. All right, one moment, please. All right, just gonna. Oops. Gonna quickly skip back to where we were. All right. So, how do we use the environmental justice screening tool? So, the first thing you're going to do, and actually, now that I'm thinking about it, let me just go ahead and put the link to the tool in the chat. Um, Alrighty. Feel free to go ahead and access that at your leisure. I should note we are having a few issues with our server um, uh, at the university, so not all of the features are working right now. We're fingers crossed we'll have everything up again within the next week, but this will still kind of cover the most of it. Anyhow, um, so how do we use this to kind of identify EJ pathogens and use it to inform communities. So the first thing you're going to do, obviously, is go to the website. Um, in the top right hand corner, you'll see a search box, and you can just type in, your location, just like in Google. What it's going to do is it's going to focus you down and bring you down to that area, right? So you'll click on that area. And when you click on the area, what it's going to give you is a list of scores. Um, and you can use this list to kind of determine, generally speaking, what bucket is impacting your community the most. So if we look here at, I believe this is Cheverly over in Prince George's County, um, it has a very low health EJ score, which means, a little bit counterintuitively, they have pretty decent healthcare within that community. But they have a comparatively high environmental effects and climate change EJ score. So, what does that tell us? Well, um, not a whole lot, unfortunately, right? This is just our starting point. So the next step then would be to go into one of those and kind of determine what is causing these high scores. So if we go into the, say, environmental effect score, we'll see that there's, you know, all of these variables. And again, all of these variables, like the EJ scores themselves, are in percentile ranges. So again, this means that 90% of all tracks are farther away from hazardous waste sites than this tract here in Chevrolet is. And because of obviously because of these two things, these two factors that are hitting 90, they increase the environmental just effect score by considerably, right? Um, and so while this neighborhood might be um, well suited in a healthcare sense, they are not well suited in an environmental sense, right? They're getting more toxic exposure than other communities. So what do we do with that? So what we do is once we located our tract, located our domain that um, is uh, causing the most issues, we that can then issue a report. Now, this is not what the report is going to look like. Again, server things, although it is pretty similar. The only difference is that it shows the um, the difference in indices between that tract and every other tract, right? So it'll show you whether or not, statistically speaking, these numbers are, beyond the pale. So I'm going to go ahead and transition into um, the actual website just so I can kind of demonstrate what that looks like. All right. So this here is the actual website of the MDEJ screen. On the right-hand side, you have your standard selection tools. So we have your layers, your search bar, full screen, so on and so forth. Now, because this is just the starting point, this actually only has one piece of data in it, and that is the EJ score, the total EJ score layer. That uh, the reason for this is simply because it's very hard to organize data, this type of data, in an intuitive way for just lay people to be able to get their hands on and kind of figure out what's going on. So we tried to simplify it as much as possible so that when you get to the website, you can just go ahead, search your neighborhood, and try to find what the EJ score is. And then if you need to get more information, you can go into the individual bins. Now, they all follow the same general idea. They have your the scores are in percentiles, and the layers contain all of the data sets that contribute to the final score. So if you're interested in just seeing how, say, COPD affects communities, is the server down? Yeah, it's down. Um, let me see, is diabetes working? Nope. This is what the gods of demonstrations are not on our side. No, all of it's not. That's okay. We can still look at the numbers. The numbers are still accurate on here. It's just the layers aren't going to be available until next week. Um, anyhow, so what this allows you to do though is it gives you a more specific idea of what pathogens are in your community and how those pathogens might be affecting you. It goes through each one of the bins, which all contain large amounts of data, um, and all of the data is available for download on ESRI's site at the moment. We are working to get it up on a GitHub page so that it's even easier for folks to access, where they don't have to go through the Esri form um, in order to get it. Um, so yeah, switch back. Okay, so what are the limitations for this? While I would like to, talk myself up and say there are no limitations, go forth. There are a lot. The main one is, and this is a really important thing to recognize, is that the index is not a diagnostic tool. You shouldn't use it to kind of determine exactly what components are and harming your neighborhood. So why is that? Well, the biggest limitation is recency is the data side limitation, right? Recency, availability, reliability, and scope. Recency, pretty straightforward. How how long ago was this data acquired? Much of our data, um, most of the demographic information, and a lot of the health information is very recent, within the last 2 years. So that gives us a really good idea of those variables in these communities. What isn't as common are things like environmental and uh, toxic facility data. That data, while there are a lot of mandates to keep up to date on those um, areas, the facilities just you know things fall through the cracks. There's a political elements that help kind of stop that data from being released in a very timely fashion. And then, of course, uh, they're not always in a format that is easily accessible. So uh, the recency is honestly probably the biggest um, limitation for this. And the other is scope resolution. Ideally, when you're talking about environmental justice, the um, closer you are to ground level observations, the more accurate you are. And the tract level, while it is, pretty small in the state of Maryland, simply because Maryland isn't as geographically big as, say, New Mexico is, and has a proportionally much higher population density, which determines how the census tracts are subdivided. It is still a very large um, collection of people in one area that you're taking this data from, and you don't get a lot of the specificity that would be really helpful in in the environmental justice context. Now, the other issue is on the statistical side. So these are things like weighting. Weighting is the act of adjusting your values by the scale of their impact um, on whatever data set you're looking at. So for our case, all of our tools are weighted by population, right? So every single or all of our indices are weighted by population, right? Because if you have an area with um, a bunch of toxic spewing facilities, but nobody lives there, are are people in that tract having their environmental justice quotient violated? It's a little more dubious there. So obviously, the higher density of people around, environmental pathogens does, increase the environmental justice quotient of that area. The issue comes in when determining how those weighted values correspond to the real world. Um, take an index by its nature a um, is a way of combining things to create just one um, one number, one variable. But because of that reduction, you lose a lot of information, right? While it is easier to understand, it's not as accurate as if you were to look at the whole picture. Um, and weighting helps offset that by creating constraints within the model to um, create a more accurate representation of how those impacts work proportionally. Um, and the statistical validity of different weighting schemas isn't as much of a science as um, people like to make it out to be, right? There is a lot of kind of intuition that you have to use to determine whether or not you are weighing things appropriately. And so while we have built our model off of, the California model, which is very reputable, um, the variation in weighting schemas amongst the tools does create a bit of a contextual differential um, when analyzing the values of this tool. Now, the other big um, limitation on the statistical side is the interpolated values. What is interpolated values? Interpolated values are um, essentially creating best guesses of what a value would be if we could, if we had that data, what could we assume this value would be essentially? And this is really important when you're using things like I'll discuss further down or further in this presentation. Um, when you're analyzing the effects of more diffuse environmental or socioeconomic pathogens, right? So um, while certain areas may have, for instance, air quality monitors, there are not air quality monitors in every square block of the state of Maryland. And because of that, we have to use the monitors we have to kind of determine what those values would be in the areas where we don't have monitors. Um, Now, while this is, invaluable as a statistical tool, it does increase the amount. Uh, it does increase the amount of error that is available in the model. So it's something to be aware of, but it's not an ultimately disqualifying matter. Uh, what is important though is that when you're using these tools, it's important to acknowledge or to understand that these are starting points. These are ways for you to engage your communities and say, hey, look how our numbers are so much worse than over there. And to kind of start developing these senses for community members to understand, how they're being either exploited or disadvantaged by environmental considerations. And that kind of dovetails quite well into understanding how we are using um, or how we can use these scores to address these environmental justice considerations. So, um, oh man, not realize how fast I was. Oh, okay. I was just making sure that I wasn't. It's not important. So, um, when we take these EJ scores, we can and take these, especially the report that can be developed from the application, um, it can allow us to have a greater understanding of the more obscure aspects of our health. Not a lot of people walk around with air monitors or bother to look or determine what kind of what that factory over there is actually doing. um, right, most folks will just kind of be like, huh, it's odd that a lot of folks in my neighborhood are getting cancer, or it seems like asthma rates are very high in my area, without kind of having the knowledge to address these at a more systemic level. So these tools, MD-EJScreen, CGIST, CalEJScreen, all of them provide an inroad for people to have an easier understanding of things that affect them. And it allows you to kind of narrowly focus in on your community to see, what things look like from a statistical perspective, as compared to the rest of the state. And it also allows you to be informed when you go and talk to your representatives, when you try to promote these environmental justice try to promote environmental justice policies. It it gives you a leg to stand on to say, I've you know I've looked at the data, I've looked at the information that's available, and these are the things that I can say are almost certainly impacting my community for the worse. What can we do to fix it? And what we can do to fix it, in one area, is to create policies that take these EJ considerations into the language of the law. Um, this proposed legislation is um, designed to prioritize spending on these communities that have um, a larger EJ burden. Um, they uh, create a meaningful number, essentially, to for government agencies to assess whether or not areas are overburdened and then respond accordingly. And so these tools can play a really important part in the actual achievement of environmental justice by using this information to um, inform the legislative process on how they can improve um, the laws to better um, support environmental justice concerns. So, real quick, I'd just like to point everybody to the um, other tools that are available in this space. So there's obviously the EPA EJScreen, which, like I said, is a very good tool, allows for a lot of interesting analysis. And in fact, we've actually used portions of their data in our tool. So there is a lot to get from that. There's the Maryland Park Equity tool that was developed at the University of Maryland by our team and members at CGIS. Unfortunately, like the MTEJ screen, it's not fully functional right now because of the server issues, but we're hoping to get it up in the next week or so again. It's just, the nature of the beast sometimes in web dev. Um, we are constantly developing new tools at Siege and creating new reports. I highly recommend folks go onto our website, Siege Center, to see what else we have. More tools are being built every day, and I think, and we're going to be starting to work on the next version of the MDEJ screen in the next year, I believe. So this is where we're going to conclude part one of the presentation. So that was covering, the general development and uses of the MDEJ screen. The next portion, which I'm going to get to in about 10 minutes, is much more technical, and it's about how the data was uh, derived. But I wanted to give some space in case folks had any questions for me at the moment before we go into the next point. If not, that's fine. I put my email up there. Feel free, while you're futzing around with the tool, um, that um, if you have any questions or if you see any errors or anything like that, feel free to send me an email. Let me know. If you have any, suggestions about how the next level of development should go, be more than happy to hear it out too. I see a question from Nick. Do you have a resource for the person designing EJ screening tools at the level? I don't myself. I can get that for you though. I believe it was session 2B or 2C yesterday, but I will look into that and check and get back to you on that. All right, if nobody has any questions, we're just gonna dive right into part two. Um, this does get a little heavy, uh, so if there are any questions while I'm going through it, please feel free to pop them in the chat, and I will do my best to answer them as I see them. All right, so proximity analysis. Now, this is what I actually spent a lot of time working on for this tool, and it's a very important new component to the MDEJ screen tool. Now, proximity analysis is kind of as it sounds, is determining the impact of a variable within a distance to another, to another person. Um, in previous versions of the MDEJ screen, we were looking at a straight proportional impact, right? How many facilities are in this tract? How many wastewater treatment plants are in that tract? And how many people live in that tract? And that was kind of how you would determine those numbers. But it's not a really good way to determine the impact of these kind of these kind of these kind of variables, right? Because well, you might live in a area with 20 factories, they all might be 10 miles away from the next house, right? And or alternatively, they could be on one side of a track and all of the people could live on the other side of the track, within a quarter mile, and the screen wouldn't pick that up. So what I did was I kind of formulated how we kind of analyze proximity in the MDEJ screen in two substantial ways. The first is in public services proximity and in environmental um, pathogens proximity. So I want to start with municipal services. So how I determined the impact of various municipal services was using a pretty simple model. It's called a proportional impact model. And it kind of works like this. So um, we have an area. So we'll take this. This is our this green dot is our facility. And we're going to kind of create an area around that facility that we can reasonably assume that facility can serve. Okay, so we're um, looking at how much of that area that the facility can serve intersects with the tract of note. So in this little model right here, I have a square tract with a population of 1,000. I'm sure it's in New Mexico somewhere. Um, and we have a facility, we'll call it a police station, right? Now, obviously, not all 1,000 people can be covered by this police station, at least not in the same rate. Folks who are closer to the police station are going to, more likely have more access or connection to the police than farther away. Um, so if we look at how that intersection relates to the total area of the tract, we can say roughly 15% of the tract is covered by this station. Now, from there, it's a pretty simple math equation, right? We take 15% of 1,000, and we can assume that 150 people are, being served at any given point. So we will take that number, and then we'll adjust it for how many people in other tracks are being served by the police. Where are there tracks that are 100% of the population are being served by the police? Are there tracks where there's no service of population of the police? Now, the only difference between the police and this model is that this model has us going by as the crow flies, as they say, right? Going straight from one point to another. But that's not how the real world works. The real world, public services are distributed by street networks. Uh, these networks are um, you know, this part of infrastructure is, what allows hospitals to receive patients, what allows police officers to catch people, what uh, determines how much contact individuals have with their local representatives, right? Um, and so, in order to account for this, we don't look at space in in determining the area these places can cover. We look at time. So if we kind of create these same buffer areas, but instead um, account for how much time it takes for say a police officer to go from a police station to the next block. Um, how many people can this police officer cover within 15 minutes? Right. So we'll take these measurements basically, and then use the proportional impact model to determine, how many residents in each one of these communities is being serviced by police. So when we do that, we get a nice pretty map like this, which gives us a lot clearer information on, where police officers are most active or most prevalent in the state of Maryland. And then we repeat that for everything from hospitals to police to libraries, um, any sort of facility that folks either go to or come from. Um, we can assess, within a 15, 30, or 45-minute time range, how many people can each one of these serve. And by doing that, we have a more objective view of what municipal services are available in each neighborhood. Now, environmental burden doesn't really work like that. It is uh, a lot harder to determine the impact of environmental um, pathogens over a large area because they're so diffuse, right? They are there's not as many concrete results necessarily, or concrete factors or variables rather that can be noticed in order to determine how the environmental burden is affecting population, right? So instead, we use what's called an inverse distance weighted model. Now, what that model does essentially, if you see over here, this is what the model does. It calculates the inverse distance from the centroid of each tract to each facility in question, and then weighs that distance by the proportional population of the tract. What does that all mean? So when we calculate the inverse distance from the centroid, basically what we're saying is we take the geography of the tract and we find the center point in there. And then we look at every facility within, say, a 5-kilometer range of that tract. And we measure its distance from, the facility to the centroid and inverse it. Why do we inverse it? Well, the that way, um, facilities that are much farther away, say if we have a facility that's 100, I guess it's not really 10 kilometers away, right? That's going to have a 1 out of 10 impact on the tract as it compared to a facility that is only 1 kilometer away from the centroid. The As you get farther away, the impact is lessened. But of course, the impact is relative to the population that can be impacted. So that's where the weighting comes from the inverse distance. Um, Now, why can't we use it in terms of how the model um, or how the track borders are delineated? Um, we can, but we can't. It's ends up creating a lot more noise because mathematically speaking, the each section of the line is a point that can be related to the facility. So there's no one um, one space that we can account for the distance of. Using a centroid allows us to create a single point that we can use to account for the distance. Now, the assumptions are, you know, pretty important, and those assumptions are um, that the environmental impacts are inversely proportional to the distance, which is generally true, but isn't always true, right? Some things can travel down and have just as bad impact throughout the whole way. Um, but for our purposes, this is a good enough um, model to kind of determine, what these effects look like. Um, so just a real quick example, we're going to consider we have all of these facilities. Each one of these facilities creates each one of these facilities creates a toxic spread, right? And we're just trying to figure out from the centroid of this tract how um, much are these tracts being impacted by these facilities. Now, as you can see, we have this facility number 3 is in tract B, but its range expands to impact tract A. So we have to consider facility 3 in the determination of the impact on tract A, even though they don't share the same borders. Because believe it or not, pollutants don't care about our borders. Um, so what we do is we kind of measure the distance from each one of these facilities to the centroid of each one. So we get, something that looks like this. We have distance 1, 2, and 3, and then we have over here we have the distance 1 and 2 for tract B, right? And then we essentially add up these values. We multiply the values by the population, and then we um, end up getting uh, a relative view of the impact or a relative impact of these facilities over an area. Now you'll see here in this picture, I'm not sure if you guys can quite make it out, but here, let me zoom in a little bit. So you'll see here in this example, I have 2 facilities in an area that's marked yellow. And this kind of harkens back to what I was mentioning earlier, which is that this facility, while it has, or this tract, while it has 2 facilities on the ground, has no population. There's nobody who claims that tract as their residence. Now, while there might still be people living there, people without homes or folks who, you know, might be working on site and sleeping on site as a result, officially speaking, there is nobody there. So the environmental burden for that neighborhood is very low. But then if you look at the next tract over, just right next to it, and even the one across the Anacostia I think that's the Anacostia. No, it's not. It's Chesapeake. Um, then even when it's across the bay, um, both of these have very high burdens, even though there are no facilities on them, and that's because of their proximity to these 2 facilities. The um, and that's why this model is so useful, right? Is it allows us to kind of determine these effects, in a clearer sense than if we, for instance, we're just looking at the numbers. And then you'll see over here, right, this area has no facility near it, but it's still redder than all the other ones. And again, that's just because of the population size. There's more people living in this area, and so they are, there are more people to be impacted by the facility of the burden. It's not a perfect model, but it really does a lot to kind of elucidate the um, burdens that you see in areas. Now, the big exceptions to this are heat and air quality. So heat, if you guys haven't noticed, it's been on the rise, and it is the deadliest environmental pathogen in the modern age. That's a whole fact. It's but what's really frustrating from a research standpoint about heat is that it's a variable that's very easy to track. We've been tracking temperatures for as long as we've been, a species with some ability to track temperatures, but its effects are a lot harder to determine, and the reason for that is simply because heat affects people in very different ways and affects environments in very different ways. So while there are some standard metrics to look for, things like, prevalence of strokes, or heat strokes, or, the, uh, relative shading in an area, it's not as clear cut because somebody who, for instance, um, has schizophrenia, um, they're much more acutely affected by heat than others. And so if you have say, a population with a low health index, therefore a um, high prevalence of, either poor physical or mental health, they are going to be impacted a lot more by heat. We won't be able to determine exactly how. And so it's a lot harder to judge what effect heat is having, um, like on an individual or on a general basis, even though it is very clear it has a huge and detrimental impact to neighborhoods. Um, AQI, on the other hand, it's a lot easier to track the impact of AQI, but it's honestly a lot harder to track the on the ground rates. Now, we uh, have been improving this, right? And I'll go into that a little bit in the next slide. But the long and short of it is that, in order to track um, the effects of AQI, it's pretty simple that you can just track um, the rates of early childhood asthma, right? As children are, as their lungs are growing, are the most susceptible, unfortunately, to negative air quality. And so, in an area where you have more kids developing bronchial issues, it's much more likely that they have a high AQI. Um, Now, we've been supplementing here at Seed, we've been supplementing the lack of state-funded AQI sensors with purple air monitors, which allow people to have a much more um, uh, personalized reading of what their air quality is in their area. And I know that a lot of J40 initiatives are trying to tackle these problems. Basically, how can we better inform communities about the risks of AQI, of high AQI, um, and how can we mitigate some of the worst effects of high heat? Now, as I was mentioning, the AQI data is um, all very challenging to get on the ground level. Um, that's starting to change. Actually, this year was the launch of the Tempo satellite, which um, is a phenomenal piece of technology for environmental justice. Because basically, what it allows is hourly updates of a whole host of tropospheric um, pollutants. And so it has NO2, it has PM2.5, black carbon, PM10, anything you could think of that can be tracked as a pollutant, this satellite is able to track. Now, the one teeny tiny issue is that at the smallest resolution, it shows data at an 11.2 square kilometer resolution, which is I believe a little over 6 square miles, a very large area. So it's not as useful for those community level readings. It is incredibly useful for understanding how um, the tropospheric layer is affecting our health in a wide array of settings, but it doesn't uh, necessarily give you the context on the ground. Things like buildings, waterways, air currents, all of that has a tremendous effect on the amount of AQI on the ground. So while it is really helpful, it is not the be all and end all of determining, these environmental justice variables. That's where the resig tool comes in. Resig is I don't know what it stands for, so please don't ask me. Um, but resig is a tool from the EPA that is basically it condenses a lot of information from a wide variety of public and specifically private data sources. Um, Now, Purple Air is they do make their data publicly available, but it's not necessarily easily accessible. And the resig actually changes that. It allows it to be a lot more accessible, and you can use it in combination with other data, including the tempo data, um, to create a much more accurate representation um, of the AQI and of environmental justice pathogens, and tropospheric ones at least, in a lot faster and a lot more accurately. Um, During COVID, the a lot of data was not being updated as it usually would for obvious reasons. And so there has been a large gap um, of actionable data from 2019 to 2022. And and this tool is starting to bridge that gap. And it's starting to make data more accessible, including pre-processing a lot of the information that was gathered over the past 2 years. So what's next for MDEJ? Um, so MDEJ is constantly in development. It's a tool that will never be perfected, right? Um, so every time we make a new version, we update the model, create um, new components, and kind of create a new presentation for it in order to kind of finally refine our ability to translate this information into action for community members, right? So um, the big thing that we're working on now is an interconnectivity with an application called MyBlockCounts that we're currently working with another developer to create. In fact, there's a session tomorrow that I would really highly recommend folks join into. It's the MyBlockCounts session where I'm going to be basically hosting a focus group so I can get your input on what this application should be like. But well, what it does is it essentially um, provides a way for community members to enter in their own data into the MDEJ screen to create even more on the ground information that can be used to verify and improve the model over the long term. Um, and in conjunction with that, we're also looking into how we can do an on the ground model assessment of these numbers. As I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of um, artistry and kind of, honestly, guesswork that goes into developing these indexes. Every index you see um, is not, the most statistically accurate piece of information. It's not really designed to be, but we need to be sure that the general sense of what it's determining is accurate on the ground. Um, and so by using, you know, on the ground assessments, we can create more we can be more sure of how valid these numbers are. While I don't have any while I'm not like worried that these numbers are totally off the mark, I think there's always room for improvement. And I think that we can create a more equitable and a more efficient tool that more accurately represents neighborhoods by um, doing a model assessment. Um, and also, we're going to be working on integrating the MDEJ screen with the Tempo satellite data. As I mentioned, the Tempo satellite was launched, I believe, in August or July, one or the other. Um, and uh, it creates a whole new variety of data that we can easily access and um, is just incredibly useful in the modern environmental age where, heat and pollutants are quickly becoming the most common natural disasters that we see everywhere, but primarily on the East Coast. I'm sure folks remember the summer um, when we had smog rolling in from, smoke rolling in from Canada for the better part of 2 weeks. Um, these things are going to be more frequent, and it's uh, imperative that we create tools that can adjust and address the changes in EJ considerations. So with that, I think we have about 10 minutes. If anybody has any questions in the chat that they want to throw out, more than happy to answer them. Let me go put my email back up. So if you guys are feeling shy, please feel free to email me um, at your leisure. If you put symposium in the subject line, I'll be able to kind of pick you out quickly without having to, having it buried in my inbox. So with that, I think that's the conclusion of the MDEJ uh, MDEJ presentation. Um, Let me know if you have any questions, and I will just hang out here for about 10 minutes. If nobody has any questions, I think we can end this a little early. Please join us for the lunchtime plenary, starting in about 20 minutes. Um, and again, please feel free to email me if you have any questions. And I implore you guys to try and join the My Block Counts session tomorrow. I would love to hear your input on how we can improve that tool and consequently improve this tool. All right. Have a nice day, everyone.